Well, it's time to get started, so take a seat. It's the Science Cafe, brought to you by OEB.
Welcome to the first cafe of the semester. It's great to see everybody here. So who we are, the organizers of Science Cafe are graduate students in the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass. And we bring you guys some science every month during the semester. And we have an invited speaker who will come and sort of submits to an interview process live in front of everybody, which is a lot of fun. And we'll open it up to audience questions several times throughout the night. We want to thank all of our funding sources, including our own program, OEB, the UMass Graduate Student Senate, the UMass Graduate School, and also the National Science Foundation for funding us tonight. We will have a photographer going around and taking pictures. That's Leon in the back right now. And a filmer, Aaron, taking some video. If you would not like to be included in photos or videos, please find one of them and let them know. And that way we can make sure that you're not public on any of the photos or videos. We will be trying to run Science After Dark again, so this was an event that we ran last year at the end of the year, so at the end of the spring semester. Where we invited every speaker back from the whole year and had sort of a more informal mix and mingle with the speakers. It was a lot of fun. People stayed for a while and chatted after the last event of the year. So more about that. Unfortunately, we can't fund that through our traditional funding sources, so we are asking for donations if you can spare some change, and that way we can sort of fund that event. Also, we'll be passing around a sign-up sheet. Please fill it out if you can. Even if you don't want to be a part of the email list, please let us know how you found out about us, because that helps us track our advertising. And we also look for topic suggestions. So we have a cafe later in the semester that's actually one of your suggestions from last year on citizen science, which this project actually also falls under too. And last but not least, I want to announce that our next cafe will be Dr. Jason Kamilar on October 12th. He's in the UMass Anthropology Department, so stay tuned for that. All right, we can get started with Jesse McClure here. So Jesse, can you tell us a little bit about your path into science?
Sure, my path into science. First, I want to say, should I use the microphone or can you all hear me? We can hear you. Okay, cool. So my path into science, or how I became a scientist, I was born.
It's a good start.
That's pretty much when I knew I was a scientist. Started taking things apart, all that. But my education, I actually had a very odd track in my education in that when I went to college, the first time, which kind of hints at some of the problems because there was a second time. The first time I went to college, I didn't really know what I was doing. And after, I think, 3 semesters, my grades kind of showed that I didn't really know what I was doing. I was interested in like engineering, math, electrical engineering, but I just didn't know what to do with any of those. One subject I was pretty confident I didn't want to study was biology, because to me that was just what you studied to go to med school, and I didn't want to go to med school, which is actually ironic because I'm currently working in medical school. But I never thought that just wasn't on my radar. But after 3 semesters of doing pretty horribly in college, I dropped out and joined the military. This was in the spring of 2001 when the world was a fairly peaceful place. Oops. So I spent much of the next 4 years over in the Middle East, but I got to travel around with my dog and a computer that is now acting up. Wonderful. There we go. So I got to travel around with my dog. There's actually 2 different dogs there. One on the right when I was in training, and the other is actually the dog that I travel with, Rebel. And I got into this job of a military working dog handler, which is where most of my career stems from that happy accident. And that we trained the dogs a lot like police canines, but they did a little more intense stuff. And over in the Middle East, we were mainly looking for the explosives, so our dogs would sniff things out. And I was really amazed at what the dogs could learn and how this whole learning process happened. And I wanted to learn more about that, so I started ordering every book I could find on animal behavior and ethology, and I was really happy to find that Amazon and Barnes & Noble would happily deliver to the Middle East, so that was useful. I don't know if they do anymore. But after that, when I finished my military service, I wanted to go back to school to study animal behavior. I was rather surprised to find that a lot of that was in the biology department, so I ended up getting my degree in biology and animal behavior. And then I went on to a graduate program where, after I learned a lot about how behavior worked, I wanted to understand how it happened in the brain. So, all behavior somehow comes from the brain, so I looked into neuroscience programs, which brought me to UMass Amherst right here. And I did my PhD here at UMass Amherst with one of my co-advisors here, Jeff Potos, which introduced me to not only his dog Caramel, which was great, but to a world of birdsong research, which was another great trajectory for my career. So yeah, that was my PhD.
Okay, and can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with Darwin's Dogs?
Another happy accident. So while I was here at UMass Amherst, it was actually a student of mine got me invited. So a student of mine was really into dog training and just kind of like if you bring your family dog to a trainer, she was one of the people doing that. And she got involved in this local networking group for dog trainers. It's called, actually it's not local, it's international, but the head of it is kind of a local woman. And it's called the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants. And they had this meeting over down in Rhode Island, and they wanted to bring in more academic behavior people. And so the head of this organization asked this student of mine, said, do you know anybody at the university who might be able to come talk about behavior? So she got me invited to give a talk there. I went and gave a talk. I met this woman, Margie, who runs that organization. And Margie is a force of nature. She is a very powerful personality. And she got me connected with a lot of very interesting people, including my current supervisor at the medical school in Worcester, Eleanor. So Eleanor has been working on genetics. Eleanor's background is all in genetics. She doesn't have any background in behavior, but she started working with dogs, and she had some really good publications and a really good line of research studying canine compulsive disorder, which is a lot like OCD in dogs. And they actually found that there are certain genes that are changed in these dogs that have this compulsive disorder that are in the exact same pathways, neurological pathways that are affected in human OCD. And they realized that dogs can actually tell us a lot about how humans work. And so she wanted to get more into studying dogs and behavior disorders. So she looked around for people who knew behavior, got in contact with Margie, and said, I'm looking for somebody who can help out in my lab. And so Margie put me in contact with Eleanor, and that was that.
Cool. So can you tell me a little bit more about Darwin's Dogs and sort of why are you jazzed to be working on that project in particular? What's the goal of it?
The main goal of Darwin's Dogs is to, I would say my goal in working with Darwin's Dogs is to understand how variability in our DNA leads to changes in, or variability in behavior. So as we kind of already heard from my weird career leading up to this, everything I've been focused on is all about behavior. So in the military, it's all kind of applied, how does behavior work? How do animals learn? I did a PhD looking at the neuroscience of behavior, what's happening in the brain, and now we look at genetics of behavior. Why are some people and some dogs more anxious or more impulsive than others? And some of that variability will come down to differences in the DNA. And dogs are actually a really cool way of studying that. Because with dogs, I think I have a slide on this. Oops, I'm actually going to skip that out, come back to that. Dog domestication, so dogs are descended from, or have a shared common ancestor with wolves. But we took them into our homes, and we selected on a bunch of behaviors that we wanted, and we selected out a bunch of behaviors we didn't want. We don't want them eating the family cat, unless, you're fond of cats. We want them to be more comfortable around humans, less, shorter flight distance so they're not going to run away, less aggressive for the most part. And we selected on this, and selection is a really cool thing, what it can do to DNA. So if you were to look at how geneticists study variability in DNA for any trait, so if we just talk about diseases, there are some changes in the DNA that can have a really big effect on a disease prevalence or disease severity. But those variants tend to be pretty rare, because if you have a variant, say there's a variant that causes Huntington's disease. Admittedly, Huntington's disease tends to affect people when they're quite old, so that variant can kind of stick around. But it's not a good thing to have. And so that kind of goes down. There's selection against that. So that trait or that variant in the DNA isn't going to stick around very well. So a lot of genes that have a substantial impact on a noteworthy trait are very rare. The one way to change that is selection. So we took dogs, or we took wolves, and we had all this selection, choosing the things we wanted. And that was the one way that you can take these variants, genetic variants, that can have a substantial effect and drive them up in frequency, so they're more common. So that makes dogs really good for finding genetic variants that are associated with behavior, because they might be a lot more common in dogs than they would be in humans or lots of other animals.
So instead of letting the chips fall where they may, we took an active hand in it, and that made quite a difference.
Yes.
Cool. So can we step back and talk a little bit about how dogs evolved to start with, and what we know about that?
We don't know a lot. Well, we know a lot, and it's all contradictory. So what we do know is that I know historically there have been some different views whether dogs came from wolves or from at one point there was a theory about the dogs being closest related to a golden jackal. We are now quite confident that the closest relative of the dog is the gray wolf. But there's been a lot of mixing between all the different species of the genus Canis. So there are 9 species in genus Canis. You've got a few different wolves. You've got the dog, which is actually still the same species as the gray wolf. We've got some jackals, dingoes. There are 9 species there. But it's a little odd that we call those separate species, because they can all technically interbreed and produce fertile offspring, that's one of the criteria we often use for defining what a species is, when things are different species or when they're the same species. So a friend of mine calls the whole genus Canis, she calls it Canis soup. It's just one group, they can all interbreed, they can all have kids, those kids can go on and have kids. And dogs are just one part of that.
And what about the breeds? How do we get different breeds?
So breeds are almost the exception that proves the rule there. So breeds are, the way we define a breed, we take a set of traits in dogs that we want, and we isolate that. And so when they form a breed, like when the American Kennel Club says this is a breed, they have the stud book, or the pedigree or the lineage, and they close the book saying nobody else can breed with these guys. It's this group and that's it. And so you get this isolated population, which from an evolutionary standpoint, that's exactly what could lead to speciation, where breeds could be different species if this went on for thousands of years. But how long have breeds been around? I actually want to know what you guys think. How long do you think, sometimes people talk about an ancient breed. What do you think an ancient breed would be? Any volunteers?
You guesses?
3,000
years. Any other thoughts?
150, that's much closer to it. I think the oldest breeds, it's really hard because the data's a little funky, but an old dog breed, we're still talking 150 to 200 years. Breeds as we now know them didn't exist until about the Victorian age, when humans decided it was a cool thing to do. Now, we certainly selected for different lineages of dogs.
Are you talking just Europe, or are you including Asia in that? Because in Asia, there are specific kinds of dogs that show up very regularly.
There's different kinds of dogs that's separate, and I will distinguish that from what a breed is. So a breed is when we really have isolated them and there's no more intermingling with others. For thousands of years, so the origin of dogs is somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 years, depending on who you ask. And for that 15 to 30,000 years, we've been breeding dogs for certain traits. So we've had lineages of dogs that were particularly good at herding. We've had lineages of dogs that were particularly good at being watchdogs or guard dogs. And they could look a little different and they behave a little different. But there was no strict delineation between these are one breed and these are another breed. This was just one line of dog that was good at one thing. So the modern idea of a breed being this isolated population, that has only been within the past 150 to 200 years.
This is a question we didn't actually talk about beforehand, but I'm curious. When we're talking about breeds, like how many individuals make up a breed? Is there like a population size estimate?
Breed.
Okay.
It varies widely. So there are occasionally some breed groups that are very proud of how diverse their breed is, and that is something they should be proud of because that's something all of our breeds need. And I don't know the best numbers on this, but I know the Jack Russell Terrier breeders are quite proud of the genetic diversity in the Jack Russells, and from the data that have been looking at with our dog's DNA, they seem to be fairly justified in that. The Jack Russells are doing pretty well. There are other breeds, and I can't remember the names of which ones it was, but there are some breeds where there are so few representatives of that breed, and there have been so few for so long, that even if there are 300-400 of these dogs, they're all almost genetically clones of each other. So in genetics, you can talk about an effective population size, basically how much diversity is there. And some breeds, the genetic diversity is so slim that it's almost as if there's only one individual of that breed. So any Star Wars fans, it's, Attack of the Clones, for that breed. And that can be a real trouble for a breed. It's hard to maintain health when you have that.
Cool. I think we're going to open it up for audience questions for a little bit. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm just curious, in North America, or the Americas, were the dogs at the time of Columbus?
Yes, there absolutely were.
Maybe they're over.
Yeah, so there were dogs pre-Columbus, and then after Columbus we brought all the European dogs over. And that is actually, that is a great question, because that is the basis for a lot of the open questions we have right now around research. It actually kind of glossed over what we're doing, and we kind of missed this question. But what we're doing, so to kind of, I'll come back to your question, I just don't want to forget about what we're doing. What we are doing at the medical school is we realized that we want to study behavioral variation in dogs. And Eleanor actually realized the opportunity for this project when she was telling her friends and neighbors and whoever she would meet about her canine compulsive disorder study. And she's saying how cool it was that we could find these genetic variants in dogs with far fewer samples, far fewer dogs than we would need to do in humans. And every time she started talking about her research, somebody would pull out their wallet to pull up pictures, or their cell phone to pull out pictures and say, "Let me show you a picture of my dog. Let me tell you all about my dog." And she goes, "Yeah, tell me all about your dog." So we set up this website where people do just that. You go on the website, you tell us all about your dog's behavior, your dog's health, everything, and then we can get a saliva sample, so we can send you a little kit to get some saliva, you send it back, we get the DNA, and then we can work with that. But one of the questions that ends up coming up is about North American dogs, because one of the things that, it's not a particular goal of ours, but we want to find ways to give back to our participants, because they're taking a lot of time filling out surveys or sending us a saliva sample. We want to find ways of giving things back that our participants want. And what almost every one of our participants wants is they say, "What is my dog? What kind of mix is it, or what's in there?" And there are actually companies out there that do specifically that for a living, and you should pay them enough and they'll make up an answer for you. But since everybody wanted that, we wanted to figure out, can we do that? And it's really kind of a big question, because this ancestry reconstruction, so the pre-Columbian dogs are one of the variables that might come into the mix here. But this ancestry reconstruction is done in humans all the time. It's more or less a solved problem in genetics. I mean, there are some details to work out, but reconstructing the ancestry of a human is pretty easy. Reconstructing the ancestry of a dog is a whole different ballgame. No matter what Eleanor says when she comes into my office, "Well, they do this with humans, you should be able to do this." Some of the things that are very different is in humans, there are, depending on who you ask, 6 to maybe a dozen source populations. You got the Southeast Asians, you got the Europeans. You've got these different source populations that any one of us might be a mix of these things. And we can figure out how much of a mix we are. We can figure out which chromosomes or which parts of which chromosomes came from Northern Europe or from Africa or whatnot. With dogs, how many source populations are there if you want to know what breeds are in Caramel? So I don't know if you guys all met Caramel, but Jeff calls her a Brazilian Husky, Amazon Huskies. What breeds are what breeds are in Caramel? How many breeds are there? How many choices are there on that multiple choice list? Somewhere between 500 and 800, as opposed to humans where there's 6 to a dozen. So there are a lot more things going into that mix. And, well, yeah, the main thing is there's a lot more variability, or a lot more source populations going into that mix. And it's we don't know nearly as much about the history. Like with humans, when they work on the ancestry reconstruction, we kind of work back and forth between the history. We know certain people migrated certain times, and we use the genetics to support that or refute that, but it's this interplay between our written and oral history and the genetic evidence that's there. Dogs, there is a history. There is this kind of written history of where these dogs supposedly came from. Most of it is completely made up. You know, a lot of the breed histories are just so stories at best, or they're what the breed clubs want, you know, what the breed clubs want to be proud of. And sometimes people will make these claims that aren't even based on real. So a friend of mine was talking about Australian Shepherds, and I said something about, I forget how it came up, but I said something about when these breeds first came over from Europe. And he just looked at me like I was an idiot. He said, well, it's an Australian Shepherd. It came from Australia. And I was actually caught off guard. I wasn't quite on my game enough to really refute it at the point, but I went home and checked. No, they came from France. They were named Australian Shepherds because they're supposed to look like something somebody saw in a picture once of a dog that they saw in Australia. So these histories are not particularly good. So the ancestry reconstruction in our dogs, when we decided we wanted to do that, one of the hurdles was to get representatives of as many of the breeds as we can. And we started doing it, and we did it on a number of dogs, including my totally mixed up puppy. And a lot of our dogs were coming out about 50% Chow Chow, which is odd. It's not an uncommon breed, but we actually had this summary of how popular a breed was and how much it was contributing to the ancestry of all our mixed breed dogs. And the Chow was just getting like 10 times as much as it should. And what we realized is that was actually a sign of something going wrong in our little computer algorithm to figure this out. And we suspected that maybe what's being assigned to the Chow is this pre-Columbus North American dog. Now, to answer that question, we need to get DNA from pre-Columbus North American dog. There are a few archaeological samples that are available, and we actually just recently got a hold of them. But working with a little bit older DNA that's been buried in the ground in a bone somewhere for a while is a little tricky, but we're working on that. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question. Yes, there were dogs. We're trying to learn what we can about them. There may be remnants of them in our pet dogs. There may not be. The jury's still out on that. I think it would be cool if it's there. It would be almost like finding Neanderthal DNA in some humans, which we've done now. And that would be really cool, but we don't yet know.
So just to clarify, those dogs they're not living currently, or there aren't sort of pure populations of them living currently?
It's not clear that they're currently alive. So now actually, one thing to put this in context is when a lot of us in the Western world think about dogs, we think about breeds or mixed breeds. People think of dogs as two types. You have your purebreds and your mixed breeds. Both of those comprise only about 10 to 15% of the dogs in the world. 85% or more of the dogs in the world are neither of those. They are what are sometimes called village dogs or feral dogs. There are different regional names for them, potcakes and satos, and I think it's Puerto Rico.
Strays, basically.
Well, stray is the wrong word too, because stray implies that they were a pet and they went astray. These are dogs that have never been, maybe they lived in somebody's home for a little while, but these are lineages of dogs that were not pet dogs at any, well, they were never pets. They've always lived around and in the vicinity of humans, but they're not pet dogs. And that's a vast majority of the dogs in the world. And those exist throughout much of the world still today. So Adam Boyko, a colleague of ours, specializes on studying these village dogs. So he goes over to India or he goes to South America, and you can find these groups of free-living, domesticated dogs all around the world. You don't really see them in America. So one of our people, Catherine Ward, is kind of looking into that to see maybe there are little pockets somewhere in North America where these exist. But it's tricky because are those really those village dogs, or are they just strays that got loose?
We have another audience question.
How do you know that the dogs, the pre-Columbian dogs that you have found are not wolves?
Good question. There are several lines of evidence, and I'm probably not the best person to speak to that question, but I'm aware of several lines of evidence. One is, there are some morphological changes, although that's tricky, because Catherine, one of our people, really harped on this. There were some studies where they did an archaeological dig, they found these bones, canid bones, and said, oh, these were clearly dogs because the skull is this shape, it's shorter, you know, all these characteristics of the skull. And she looked at that paper and said, that's just a puppy. Maybe a dog or just maybe a wolf puppy. But there are some morphological differences. There are also the anthropologists and archaeologists who often uncover these. They're finding them buried with humans or beside humans, or there's evidence that they were buried by humans. So you could come up with some tall tale of why humans were burying wolves, but more likely they were.
Domesticated wolves or coyotes.
Well, a domesticated wolf is a dog.
Okay.
Dogs and wolves are the same species. So there's the only delineation there is that whether they're domesticated. And if they're living with humans, they're a dog.
Is that true for coyotes?
Do coyotes live with humans?
So recently I heard that in the East, coyotes are wolves mixed with domesticated dogs.
Yes. Actually, around here, coyotes are, I'm not sure there are any pure coyotes. So there's these terms they use, coy wolf or coy dog, and again, it's the Canis soup. All the so-called species of genus Canis, they're just, you know, they're having a good time together. And so the things that we call coyotes, they have more of the ancestry of the coyote lineage that makes them, you know, stay farther away from humans. They're more of scavengers, not so much hunters. But the reason we notice them a lot now, coyotes are coming into our yards, coyotes are coming into our apartment complex, most likely because they're getting some of that dog ancestry. They're getting some they're getting some of the genetic variants that make them a little less wary of humans, a little more willing to come into our where we live.
So they're still all the same species, coyotes and wolves and dogs.
It depends who you ask, which species. So in biology, the idea of a species is really, you know, it's kind of, you know, pull back the curtain, there's not much there. And we like to categorize things. We humans, we like to put labels on things and categorize them. But species is just one of those weird things that it often doesn't work as cleanly as we'd like it to. So there's the biological species concept, which is what we're all probably taught in high school, is that if these things can interbreed and have fertile offspring, they're the same species. If that's a rule, then all of genus Canis is the same species, every single one of them, except German Shepherds and Chihuahuas, because good luck getting that to work. But there are other species concepts. So morphological species concept, this is actually cool because the morphological species concept, if I can get my projector going again, is, like the name implies, it's based on, do these things, are they similar? Do they look alike? And, there it goes. So these are 4 different quote-unquote species of genus Canis. I mean, you got different colors there, but those don't look like totally different things. These look like totally different things. Yet we say these are 4 different species. We say these are all the same subspecies of one species. So the morphological species concept doesn't work so well. There are some other ones that are looking at the genetics and the phylogeny. And then the phylogeny is kind of where we really want to base a lot of this. And by that, we would categorize all of our dogs as the same species, and then all these 4 would be distinct, because for the most part, these 4 are not interbreeding. Now, we've got our coyotes here on the East Coast, but yes, there's this swapping of DNA, but they're not totally mixing together. There's some intergressions when one species comes in and contributes some DNA to that lineage. So actually, genus Canis is a lot more like bacteria. That's the way bacteria work all the time.
I think we have to move on, but hold on to those questions. So I wanted to ask you briefly, what kinds of differences are there between breeds? So we talked a little bit about maybe the morphology.
Yep.
Maybe start there.
Yeah, so there's huge differences in morphology. So as that picture partially captures. And I think this is cool because, so who here likes really large dogs, like the really large breeds? You are aware that those large breeds suffer some problems due to their size, right? What are some of the problems that the large breeds have? Hips. What else? Shorter life overall. What ends up killing them? heart, cancer. Cancer actually affects a lot of the dogs pretty fairly evenly. What's that?
Bad knees.
Bad knees, joint problems, heart problems. Heart problems are really common in large dogs, and it's basically because they've all got about the same heart. But you can take a Chihuahua and Saint Bernard, and you get, I think it's about a 10-fold difference in size. Where if you just put that into, I like to put this into perspective of what that would mean for humans. So in humans, what's an average size human? Maybe 5'10" or so. What's a really large human? You guys know who Andre the Giant is, right? I think he was 7'4". So was that like a 30–40% difference? And he died of heart problems because of his size. You have dogs that are 10 times the size of another one, and they're starting to have problems because of their heart. So if you have a dog, go home and recognize what a great heart your dog has. Because somehow, despite the fact that we push them to the limits where they are having these problems, they manage to cope pretty well. Because they have these huge differences in morphology. And if we want to understand the genetics that goes into these changes in morphology, if we want to find genes that code for growth rate, we can look at humans, and this has been done actually quite effectively, finding a bunch of genes that have a little effect on how tall you grow. But we can look at dogs, and we're going to see a much clearer picture. You know, we actually get a whole different set of genes in dogs and humans. It's a different story. But you can see genes that affect coat color, because you can see total differences in coat color, size, structure, body shape. There's just so much variability to cash in on.
Okay, and what about the behavioral variation?
Just as much.
Yeah.
That, I will argue, though, does not align with breed nearly as much, if at all. And that's one thing that we have found in our data pretty conclusively, is that all of them, though, I'll call them myths, all the myths people have about certain breeds having certain temperaments are just, there's nothing to it. Now, there are certain traits that go with certain breeds. A retriever is going to retrieve. A basset hound probably isn't going to retrieve. Now, if you're a decent trainer, you can make a basset hound retrieve. And if you're a decent trainer, you can convince a golden retriever or a Labrador retriever or a German shepherd not to chase it when you throw. But it's not easy, which, by the way, is why military dog handlers don't carry grenades. So you can change these behaviors. There are predispositions that retrievers retrieve, bassets don't, livestock guarding dogs will bark at things, whatnot. But when you talk about anything that you would call temperament or personality, that's actually one of my things I really wanted to look at is, can we find variability in kind of large-scale temperament and personality? So in humans, you might call it extroversion, but we have a lot of our survey questions can get at sociality with humans, or how they socialize and play with other dogs, or anxiety, fearfulness, impulsivity. These are all traits that we're capturing very well in our surveys, and we see a wide range of variability between dogs, but it doesn't align at all with breed. There are a few little exceptions, but for the most part, and so this is my kind of public service announcement, is that if you want to get a dog, and if you're looking for a puppy and you say, and there will be some dog people who will tell you to do this, they'll say, look at your life, figure out what you want. Do you want a calm dog? Do you want an active dog? And then you kind of delineate what you want in a dog, and they'll tell you which breed to choose based on those criteria. That's crap. Don't do that. You should lay out those criteria. What are you looking for in a dog, and what can you commit to in a dog? And then go find a litter of dogs and say, well, I want an active dog. Let me take the most active one out of this litter. You're going to have to do far better with that than choosing based on breed, because the most active dog of a quote-unquote non-active breed is more active than the least active border collie, which tend to be active.
So, how are you studying behavior? Yeah, go ahead.
Through the surveys. So we have these, I think I have a picture of this coming up. Oh yes, there it is.
I've actually done it with my stepmother. It is quite extensive.
Yeah, so we are now asking, I think about...
For my dog.
For our family dog. I found my stepmom who knows the dog line. Sorry.
We got a slide sample. We're going to try to figure out what she is. But...
I'll be sure to show her this moment in the video. That's great.
these survey questions, and we continue to add more. And actually, that's one of the goals of our project, and it's one of the things that really surprised us, and I can kind of add one of the later questions, I think. But one of the things that really surprised us is that Eleanor, the PI of the lab, my supervisor, doesn't think or underestimated how crazy dog people are. Because we had all these surveys, so we collected so we assembled these surveys from a number of different sources. There were a number of published surveys on dog behavior. So Sam Gosling down at the University of Texas has done some really good work, basically taking human personality surveys and saying, can we apply these to dogs? And he and a student, Amanda Jones, did that and just worked for years on all the parts of survey development that I never really want to do, and thank God they did. We can just take it and use it. So we're using their survey, we're using several other published surveys, but we also pulled up that woman Margie, who I mentioned earlier, who runs this International Association of Dog Trainers, basically. People who just work with dogs all day long, pet training, behavior consulting for dogs with behavior problems. And we got together a group of these people and said, what should we be asking about? What kinds of questions can we ask to get at the variability in dogs? Hi, Caramel. And so they assembled a bunch of our questions too. And a cool part of just the kind of survey development side is that when you give survey questions, we know, so this, we'll just preface if there's a concern about, well, surveys suck, and yes, they do, but we can still make good stuff out of them. When you ask questions, and I'll just draw the analogy to human personality surveys, we can score traits like extroversion versus introversion in the human. And you might be asked a bunch of questions like, do you like to talk in front of people? Do you like to go out to loud parties? Do you invite people over? I don't know, I'm not a personality psychologist. But you can ask a bunch of these questions and people will always complain. Every single one of us, when we take those tests, we say, well, this is stupid. I mean, yes, I like to talk in front of people, but it's my job. And so you always are gonna look at that question and say, that's not really who I am. But that's why you ask a lot of those questions. And on average, when you put them together, you are gonna get a consistent, reliable metric. And so that's what we're doing with the dogs. We ask dozens of questions that get at impulsive behavior. And we can see overall that some dogs are higher versus lower. But the questions that our animal behavior consultants put together don't correlate with any of the others. So all the personality surveys, we get these nice clusters or factors of all these questions that go together, and all of our behavior consultant questions are kind of these one-off ones that just don't lump together with anything else. I don't know if that means they're really good questions or they're really bad questions. Could be either one. Because if they're really bad questions and people answer them randomly, that's what would happen. If they're really good questions and they're capturing something totally unique, that's what would happen. We might be able to figure that out once we get the DNA and say, does that actually account for anything?
Awesome. So let's open it back up to audience questions. We had two, yeah, you had a question before, I think?
And check.
No, sorry. Yeah.
And it's actually a better question now than it was before. It's more relevant to what you've been talking about now, or ties them together. Decades ago, Ray Coppinger and his colleagues were arguing for particular kinds of connections between morphology and behavior and tying that to degrees of neoteny. And now that you can do the good genetic work, the question is that stuff holding up at all?
What's neoteny for people who may not know?
So it's basically the maintenance of juvenile traits. So the floppy ears, the bigger eyes sometimes, things like that. And I don't know if I'm the one to speak to that. I don't think there's a lot of evidence in favor of it. I'll also say that Ray Coppinger was brilliant, wonderful guy, but he argued for a lot of crazy stuff. He's just one of those people who likes to go out there and say bold things, and a lot of the times he's right on the mark, and a lot of times he's like, come on. So that, if I were to put money on it, might be a little towards that latter group. But I don't have a lot of evidence to base that on yet. The general idea of neoteny is kind of much more downplayed now. It's just not, it's not a really useful.
But how about the morphology behavior?
Morphology, yes. To an extent, I would think there's definitely something to that. Breeds have really screwed that up, though. So I'm not going to go back to it, but if you remember back to that plot of domestication of dogs. We had wolves, then we had domesticated dogs, or dogs that we were domesticating for tens of thousands of years. Again, depending on who you ask, it might have been 12,000, might be 30,000, it's really wacky. But it's tens of thousands. And we've had breeds for about 200 years. Breeds are isolated. There's not much selection, if any, within breeds. We're not selecting for anything within a breed. We just chose from the standing variation that was already there. During that tens of thousands of years, we were selecting for behaviors and for morphology. And they do go hand in hand. And there's a reason the greyhound can run fast, or on the flip side of that, there's a reason the greyhound has long legs and is very lean. Because to be able to do the job that they were bred for, that lineage was bred for, they needed to have certain morphology. So to that extent, absolutely. In our modern breeds, that is kind of falling apart. Because now our breeds, with very few exceptions, we're not maintaining breeds based on the behaviors they're supposed to have. There are some working lines where they're doing pretty well, where you have working lines of some breeds and they're focusing on that, and that's great. But most of our purebred dogs are show lines.
But to push back with dogs for whom we're trying to breed for particular kinds of behavior patterns, herding dogs, guard dogs, livestock guarding dogs, and so forth.
Yep.
Is morphology a reasonable predictor of behavior in those breeds, which is what Dr. Jules are looking for, right?
That's a good question.
With the claims about Moremas versus Border Collies. I just want to know if it holds up. I'm just curious.
Actually, well, I will say yes and no, because I bet is it a good predictor? Yes. Is there any causal link? Probably not. It's a good predictor, because if these things just, if you breed big dogs that do this job and you do little dogs that do that job, you can predict what job they're going to do based on their size. But there may or may not be any causal link there. It's just that that's how the correlation pans out. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but one might be looking for a kind of tertium quid that's actually causally related both to morphology.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the point of the Neoteny stuff. A tertium quid might not be that, but yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Another question from the audience? Yes. You?
No, I think this hand's been up for a while. So.
I have a question about behavior. So in my experience with dogs that I've had, they always seem to be able to recognize that another dog is a dog, even though there's that broad. Even though you might think that Chihuahua looks more like a cat. How is it reacting to the dog like it's a dog and not like it's a cat? I mean, is it just, have you seen that? And also, is it just smell, or is it something like cooler than that?
That is an awesome question. It's not one that we're particularly focused on. I know there are researchers who are looking at that specifically. I'm trying to remember the context of it, but there was a study that was out recently. I think it was actually the cognitive psych group that was doing this. They were showing dogs pictures of other dogs versus pictures of slightly changed, photos of slightly changed images of dogs versus photos of cats. The stuff cognitive psych people like to do, just show people lots of pictures on a screen for hours on end, and then pay them $100 for the time, or a couple of dog biscuits in this case. And they were doing some really cool stuff with that and getting at that question. I don't know the answer, but it is intriguing that yes, dogs, for the most part, can recognize that another dog is a dog. I laughed as you asked that question, because one of our survey questions is, so it's basically on a Likert scale, whether you strongly agree to strongly disagree, and it's, my dog knows he or she is a dog. And that's been the reaction to that question, and it's really funny where that question came from. Most of our questions, I kind of glossed over this earlier, Eleanor thought that dog people wouldn't want to sit through 150 questions. So we set up our site with these blocks of about 10 questions each. So people, with the idea that people would do 10 questions, go away, come back later, do another 10 or 20, go away, come back later. Everybody just came in and did them all, which is both good and bad, because we want to get people in the habit of coming back, because we want to release new surveys. But one of the questions was, my dog knows he is a dog. And that came from, because I tried to group these in kind of thematic groups. And we had this one group that had 9 questions. And I'm like, it's just, maybe I have OCD, I should take my own genetic sample and figure that out. But I didn't want this group to have 9 questions, so I need to throw one question in there. So it was total throwaway question that wasn't supposed to mean anything. I threw it in there, and we have this comment box that people can add comments to a question. We've had more comments for that question than a lot of people love it, a lot of people hate it, and I'm really excited to know if there's any genetic correlation with that question, because that would just be cool.
Maybe
But,
the owners.
yeah, some of our questions, we actually know that some of our questions are telling us more about the owner than the owner.
Couple more questions?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
that was my question was, are you controlling it all for the humans answering the survey? Are you asking some questions about the humans?
No. And there's a reason for that, is in the research world, you need different, so whenever scientists do research, where there are no more mad scientists, well, except Jeff over there, he's a little crazy, there's lots of oversight. Everything we do has to be checked by and overseen by different committees. And so when you work with animals, there's what's called the IAC committee. When you work with humans, there's the IRB, it's Institutional Review Board, I think. I don't work with humans, so I don't really know. So one oversees animal research, one oversees human research, which I just think is silly because humans are animals, right? But there are two very different committees, two different sets of hoops you have to jump through, and we have an IAC protocol. And we're specifically not allowed to ask our human participants anything about themselves. And so we actually quite facetiously realized one day that we cannot ask if the owner smokes. We can ask if the dog is exposed to tobacco smoke in the home. We can't ask if the owner is divorced. We can ask if the dog lives in a broken home. So that maybe highlights why this IRB thing is a little silly, but we can't, well, if we did get an IRB, we could actually get those demographics, and we've thought a little about whether we should. But there's enough variability within the answers, and the answers are noisy. All survey data is noisy. And that's why right now, we have 14,000 dogs enrolled, which is really amazing. We're hoping for 5,000 dogs within the first 3 years. We've been going for almost 2 years, we have 14,000. Which means that there's a lot of noise. Well, there can be a lot of noise. There can be a lot of random wackiness in there, but we hope that that will all come out in the wash. If you look across 14,000 sets of survey answers, the only remaining consistent trend will be about the dog and the dog's behavior.
You've had a question for a while, right?
Yeah, I'm curious what you think about the notion that the pit bull or the groups of dogs that belong to the pit group are particularly predisposed genetically to being aggressive, mean, and dangerous.
I will say absolutely not,
Thank you.
but then I will give some caveat. So this goes to all breed-specific legislation's crap, pardon my language, but that's what it is. Absolutely not. They're not genetically predisposed. They're not predisposed to even take out genetic. They're not predisposed in any way to be any more or less aggressive than any other dog. Now, some of my friends have argued that point, and no, I don't think anybody working with dogs or working in genetics would argue that these pit bull breeds or bulldog breeds are predisposed towards aggression or violence. However, some people will point out that they are very strong, very muscular, and there are features of their jaw that if and when these dogs bite, they can do a lot more damage than a Chihuahua. Chihuahuas actually bite a lot more often. It's actually because people ignore, when a little thing growls, oh, wasn't that cute? Pit bull growls, people walk away. So there is potential that they could do a lot more damage. And I'm really potentially going out of my bounds as a researcher into the political world, but I will, since I'm on the stage, I'll do this. The breed-specific legislation, to me, there's truth in the statement that if a pit bull attacks somebody, they can do more damage than if a Chihuahua attacks somebody. There's truth in the statement that if I attack somebody, I could probably do more damage than if you attack somebody. Or certain genders of people, certain ethnicities of people, perhaps, you can make that same argument. It would be absurd to, actually, sadly, our legal system does have a lot of bias in it that we all hopefully think is absurd and we're trying to get rid of. So I hope we don't try to introduce it into the dog world just because a dog is more muscular.
Thank you.
Just how is that different than retrievers retrieving?
Oh, I would not say there's no a priori assumption that it couldn't be, that some breeds are more aggressive.
I just was curious, I'm not say one way or the other. I just don't understand where, you know, labs are very energetic and the retrievers have a tendency to treat. And
The difference is actually the data. So it's certainly possible that a breed could be more aggressive than another breed, or a breed could be predisposed to violence. There's no evidence that the pit bulls are genetically predisposed to be. Pit bulls sometimes are because they're made that way. Just like in humans, there are certain socioeconomic statuses that might engage in more crime. It's not because there are certain genetic backgrounds that are predisposed to crime. If you grow up in that environment, it can impact you.
So part two, could you train a golden retriever to be as aggressive and dangerous?
Oh, absolutely.
Could train a pit bull?
Yes.
Okay.
You saw the pictures of my military dogs at the beginning, right? Those weren't pit bulls.
No, they were shepherds, they're
Yeah.
pretty, whatever, too.
Yeah.
Have you seen the correlation with color? There's some behaviors like for labs, we'll turn around and say the black labs and the, you know, they'll say like.
I love this
they can
question.
tell you when the kid-
Yeah, so
When the puppy will be.
the biggest one with that is the chocolate labs.
Yeah.
Dog people think chocolate labs are crazy.
I work for a veterinarian, I would say that there's a correlation with the dogs that come in, brown labs.
Okay, here's my concern with that. So we actually had this, I think it's a cool question because we had this huge argument at our last consortium meeting, so we meet with all of our animal behavior people.
When you do the surveys and stuff, do you ask about color?
Yes.
Okay.
But there's a difference between, so when we had our last consortium meeting just a couple months ago, it was me, Eleanor, the scientist, the geneticist, and then this whole group of the working animal behavior people who, you know, take in clients every day for behavior problems. There are 2 veterinary behaviorists there. People work in veterinary offices, so they work every day in and day out with dogs. They swore up and down that this belief about chocolate labs being crazier was real. And Eleanor was going mad. She's saying it can't be. It is absolutely impossible because you can't breed you don't breed chocolate labs. You breed labs. You get some black, some yellow, some chocolate. They have there's no separation. There's no lineage of chocolate labs and a lineage of black labs. So the only way that it could be a genetic cause is if the exact same gene, or something very close to the same gene, but we've been doing enough breeding that it pretty much have to be the exact same gene, causes the change in color and the change in behavior. And we know what that gene is, and there's no sensible reason it would impact behavior. Now, I got in the middle of this fight and tried to make some sense of it because we have the geneticists over here with very good data saying this is absolutely impossible for this to be a genetic thing. We have all the people who work with dogs every day saying, well, it absolutely is a real thing. And they're both staring at each other like, you're crazy, you must be wrong. And I'm like, well, there are more explanations for behavior than genetics. So this may sound far-fetched, but to me it is by far the most parsimonious answer. Chocolate labs are treated differently. You get a chocolate lab, you have the stereotype, or you have a suspicion about the behavior, they're treated differently. Now, I don't know if that's the answer. I have no evidence for that, but to me that is the only even moderately personal
So we're fast approaching the end of the time. I did want to ask you like 1 or 2 sort of end questions about the project, and if maybe you could stick around for a little bit afterwards, people can come up and ask questions after. So you said, you know, we've been talking about genetics the whole way through, but you said that part of what you want to do is tie some of this behavioral variation to genetic variation.
Yep.
How are you going about that?
Not very well.
Genetics is hard, guys.
Yes. Well, no, it is hard. It's expensive. So there are a few different approaches that we can use. So we are getting saliva samples, so I mentioned that. And if you have a dog and you're not already enrolled, I've got some rat cards and business cards back there. We'd love to have you. We send out this kit, you take some saliva, you send it back, we can get the DNA out of the saliva. That, believe it or not, is the easy part. Now we need to turn that DNA into some meaningful data. And there are a few different ways of doing that. One is called genotyping, which is used extremely well in humans for a couple of reasons. It's challenging in dogs. But basically the idea of genotyping is, we all probably know DNA is made up of these 4 letters, G's, C's, T's, and A's, more or less, and it's a really long string. In humans there's actually 23 strings, in dogs there's 39, but you can think of it as one really long string of letters. And people have heard of DNA sequencing. That's when you go in and your goal is to read every single letter. You can't actually quite achieve that goal most of the time, but that's basically what you're doing, is you're reading along that string, figuring out what's there. Genotyping is a different approach where you know, if you already know what should be there, you can basically take a bunch of yes or no questions. Do you have this one or this one? This one or this one? This one or this one? And you look at a bunch of these spots across the genome. And as it turns out, you don't need to read the whole genome most of the time, because you've all heard some numbers about how similar all of our DNA is. You know, humans share, depending on which metric you use, 95, 99%. Actually, Norm could probably give a much better number than I can. But some enormous percentage of our DNA is identical. It's what makes us a human. It gives us 10 fingers, 10 toes. It's what makes us human. There's a smaller number of variable spots. So it's practical that you could just check those spots that we know to vary. It's the same in dogs. Most of their DNA just makes them a dog. They have about 25 billion letters in their DNA. About 25 million tend to vary across dogs. So in theory, we should be able to just look at those. The problem is in humans, the technology for doing that genotyping of just sampling those spots has developed much faster than it has in dogs. So the dog, or the human genotyping arrays, I haven't even kept up, but they basically capture almost all the variability. Or if you do some computational magic with what you get, you can basically capture almost all the variability. Dogs were capturing about 5 to 10%. And we realize if we're studying behavior, that's not good enough. The problem is genotyping a dog costs $100, $150. Sequencing, where you read everything, that's still costing around $1,000 to $1,500. And I told you I have 14,000 dogs. 14,000 times 1,000. We don't have $14 million in our couch cushions. So we're now taking a new approach of what's called low coverage sequencing, which if you want to know what this is, talk to me afterwards. Basically, it's a similar idea of reading every letter, except you're just getting a glance at the whole thing. And through some computational tools, as long as you do that with lots of different dogs, you can put those together and make some pretty strong inferences about what each dog has at that spot.
So my last question for you is, have you had any breakthroughs with the data so far, the genetic data maybe specifically?
So we've learned a couple of things. One kind of concrete useful thing is we found a genetic variant, and so as a corgi breeder group came to us, I think it was actually both the Pembroke and the Cardigans have the same heart problem. There's this, it's PDA, I can't remember what it stands for. It's a heart condition in corgis. I just think it's hilarious because corgis PDA, so we have these pictures of corgis, public display of affection, hugging each other. But there's this heart disease that affects corgis, apparently pretty badly. And these corgi breeders came to us and said, can you help us figure out what this is? And this is very new, and this is very preliminary, but we did a study of the variability in the corgis that had the condition and the ones that didn't, and we found one very striking position that differed between them. So this is not yet conclusive, but we're fairly confident and very happy that we have a pretty strong candidate for what might be associated with that disease and potentially causative for that disease. And if that's true, we could test for it in other corgi lineages, and that could lead to informed breeding, which I will say is challenging, because just because you have a genetic test for something, that's actually dangerous, because then the breeders will say, oh, this dog has that genetic variant, let's not breed them anymore. And what that does is it takes a small gene pool and makes it smaller. And most of the health problems we have in pure breeds is because there is such a small gene pool. You cannot take out bad things and end up in a better place. It just won't work. You might get rid of the PDA, but you'll end up with something worse. Even it amazed me, a friend of mine at the Broad Institute, where they do genetics, like these people know genetics. He said to me one time, he says, so these purebreds have all these genetic diseases. We should be able to figure that out, right? Well, hopefully. He says, well, we should just be able to breed out those traits. You cannot breed out diseases that are caused from a small gene pool. You have to breed in health. And that's what none of the breed groups want to hear. To make a healthier golden retriever that doesn't get 5 kinds of cancer, you need to breed in non-golden retrievers. Oh, the other breakthrough. We have found that our American mutts are like caramel, are far, far more diverse than anyone previously imagined. The idea that they're a mixed breed of several breeds, like caramel might be a husky, shepherd, something, probably not. Caramel's probably a mix of about 50 or 60 different things, going back several generations mixing. Maybe not. There are certainly recent crosses, like our golden doodles, that's just a golden retriever and a poodle. But most of our mutts are really mixed up, interesting creatures.
All right, well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much. And like I said, we'll be hanging out for a little bit.